The search team leader looked at her gear and laughed. "Sweetheart, this isn't a hiking trail. Go home before you get someone killed looking for you," he said, loud enough for the whole crew to hear. What he didn't know was that underneath her plain civilian clothes were scars from operations most people would never survive hearing about, and that she understood exactly what waited in that cave system better than anyone else standing on that ridge. She didn't answer him. She just checked her gear and disappeared into the dark alone. 6 hours later, she found someone 300 feet underground that even she couldn't bring herself to believe was real. The search had started 3 days earlier, when a graduate researcher named Colin Ashby failed to check in after a solo mapping expedition into the Hollow Vein Cave system, a labyrinth of limestone passages beneath the Kentucky Hill Country that had swallowed more equipment than explorers over the decades, mostly because most explorers had the sense to stay out of its deeper sections. Colin had not had that sense, or had had it and ignored it anyway, and by the time his university reported him overdue, the trail leading into the mountain had gone cold in every sense that mattered. Dana Whitfield arrived at the staging area on the morning of day 3, in plain civilian hiking clothes, carrying her own gear rather than borrowing from the search cache, and asking to be added to the team assigned to the cave's lower chambers, the section every other volunteer had quietly avoided requesting. Russ Calloway, the search team leader, a broad man in his 50s who had run cave rescue operations in this county for over 2 decades, looked at her intake form, looked at her, and laughed before he'd fully processed what he was laughing at. "Sweetheart," he said, "this isn't a hiking trail. Go home before you get someone killed looking for you." A couple of the younger volunteers standing nearby smirked. One of them, a college-aged kid named Tyler who'd shown up in brand new gear still creased from the packaging, didn't bother hiding his amusement at all. Dana didn't argue. She didn't explain herself. She simply looked at Russ for a moment with an expression that gave away nothing, then turned and walked toward the cave's main entrance, where the rest of the assigned teams were doing final equipment checks before their scheduled descent. "Ma'am, that's not your team," Russ called after her. "I know," Dana said, without turning around. She checked her own harness, her own headlamp, her own line, with the specific, unhurried thoroughness of someone who had checked equipment like this more times than she could count, in conditions considerably less forgiving than a Kentucky limestone cave. Then she stepped past the roped-off staging area and into the entrance passage alone, before anyone standing there had fully decided whether to stop her. Nobody stopped her. If you've made it this far and this story already has your attention, take a second to hit that like button. It costs nothing, and it means everything for a channel like this one. The entrance passage was wide enough to walk upright for the first 100 yards, the limestone walls damp and cool, the sound of dripping water echoing from somewhere deeper in the system. Dana moved through it without hesitation, her headlamp cutting a narrow cone through darkness that had swallowed sound and light in equal measure for longer than anyone in that county had been alive. She'd studied the cave's known survey maps before arriving, the same maps every official search team had access to. But she moved through the passages the way someone moves through a space they've already memorized rather than a space they're discovering for the first time. Not because she'd been in this specific cave before, but because caves like this one, systems this old and this layered, all shared an underlying logic once you understood how water carved stone over enough centuries. She read the walls the way other people read directions. 2 hours in, the passage narrowed into a crawl space barely wide enough for her shoulders. The kind of section that had turned back 3 separate volunteer teams over the preceding 3 days, each of them citing claustrophobia, equipment limitations, or simple good sense as their reason for retreating. Dana didn't retreat. She dropped to her stomach, exhaled to flatten her chest against the stone, and pulled herself forward through darkness that pressed in from every direction at once. The specific, controlled stillness of someone who had done this before, in places and conditions she did not think about anymore unless something forced her to. The crawl space opened, after nearly 30 minutes of controlled, patient movement, into a chamber larger than anything on the official survey maps, a cavern easily 80 feet across with a ceiling lost somewhere above her headlamp's reach. Water pooled in shallow basins across the chamber floor, and the air carried the specific mineral coldness of a space that had likely not felt outside air in longer than the cave's official surveys had existed at all. She found Colin Ashby's abandoned pack near the chamber's far wall, soaked through, its contents scattered in a pattern that told her he'd panicked here, badly, at some point in the last 3 days. There was no sign of Colin himself. There was, however, something else. Near the base of the chamber's far wall, where the limestone gave way to a narrower secondary passage she hadn't seen on any survey map, Dana found a series of markings scratched into the stone. Not random, not the panicked scrawl of someone lost and frightened, but deliberate, methodical, the kind of markings someone leaves when they intend for another trained eye to eventually understand them. Her chest tightened in a way it hadn't in a very long time. She knew that marking system. She'd learned it decades earlier, in training conditions she rarely allowed herself to think about directly, from an instructor who had drilled it into an entire generation of operators as a wilderness communication method for exactly this kind of scenario. Deep terrain, no radio contact, the possibility of needing to leave a trail only certain people would recognize as anything more than scratches on rock. Subscribe to Legendary Veterans, because what Dana finds at the end of that marking trail is something her own team's worst nightmares couldn't have prepared her for. She followed the markings through the narrow secondary passage, her pulse elevated now in a way that had nothing to do with physical exertion. The passage descended sharply, twisting through several tight switchbacks that would have been genuinely dangerous without the specific caving experience she carried, until it opened into a second, smaller chamber, dimly visible even before her headlamp fully illuminated it, because a faint, flickering light source was already burning somewhere inside. A small fire, carefully contained within a ring of stones, cast long shadows against the chamber walls. Someone had been here for considerably longer than 3 days. The chamber showed the specific, disciplined organization of long-term habitation rather than a lost hiker's panic. Supplies arranged methodically along one wall, a sleeping area constructed with careful attention to the chamber's natural contours, water collection points positioned to catch mineral runoff at its cleanest source. An older man sat near the fire, gaunt, his beard long and gray, his clothing reduced to little more than functional rags reinforced with what looked like cave debris and improvised stitching. He looked up as her headlamp swept across the chamber, and his eyes, sharp and entirely too alert for a man who should have been suffering the effects of prolonged isolation, tracked her with a wariness that had nothing confused about it at all. "You're not the graduate student," he said. His voice was rough with disuse, but carried an odd, careful precision, the specific precision of a man who had spent a great deal of time not speaking and hadn't lost his ability to choose words deliberately when he finally did. "No," Dana said. Her own voice had gone unsteady in a way she hadn't expected. "Then how did you find the marking system?" It wasn't quite a question. It was closer to a demand the world explain itself. Dana crouched at the edge of the firelight, close enough to see his face clearly now, and something in her chest that had been tightening since the first chamber finished collapsing into a recognition she still couldn't fully accept. "Because you taught it to me," she said. 20 years ago, before either of us should have still been alive to have this conversation." The old man went very still. "Say your name," he said quietly. "Dana Whitfield." She watched his face for any reaction. "You called me Whit. You told me I asked too many questions during land navigation and that it would either get me killed or keep me alive, and you never told me which one you actually believed." Something in his expression cracked open, slowly, the specific unraveling of a man encountering a piece of his own past he had never expected to see again. "Whit?" he said, and it wasn't quite a question anymore either. It was closer to disbelief, finally losing an argument it had been having with itself for a very long time. "It's me," Dana said. "I didn't believe it either. Not until I saw the markings." The old man was quiet for a long moment, his eyes moving over her face with the specific intensity of someone cross-referencing a memory against a present that didn't entirely match it yet. "You were 22, he said finally. "Skinny kid who couldn't do a proper fireman's carry to save her life. Look at you now. 20 years does that," Dana said. 20 years, he repeated, and something in the way he said it suggested the number carried a weight she hadn't yet understood the full shape of. If you've ever wondered what it feels like to find someone the entire world had stopped looking for, stay with us. Because what this man says next is going to change everything you think you understand about how long a person can disappear. "How long have you been down here?" Dana asked. The old man, His name was Harlan Reese, though Dana hadn't said it out loud yet, hadn't needed to. The name arriving in her memory the instant his face fully registered, looked toward the chamber's dark ceiling for a long moment before answering. 18 years, he said. Dana's breath caught. 18 years, she repeated, needing to hear herself say it before she could fully process it. You've been in this cave system for 18 years. Not all of it in this chamber, Harlan said. I've moved through several sections over the years. This one has the most reliable water source, so I've stayed here the longest. He said it with the specific flat practicality of a man who had stopped finding his own circumstances remarkable a very long time ago. You were declared dead, Dana said. 18 years ago. There was a service. I was there. I stood in the back because I didn't think I had the right to stand anywhere closer, and I watched them fold a flag for a body that was never recovered. And I have spent 18 years believing you died on an operation nobody was ever allowed to explain to me. Harlan's expression shifted into something that looked, for the first time since she'd entered the chamber, genuinely pained. The operation went wrong, he said. Worse than wrong. I was the only one who made it out of the extraction point, and by the time I did, the people who would have needed to authorize my return had decided it was cleaner for the official record if I didn't. He looked at his own hands, scarred and weathered in the firelight. I was given a choice. Come back and answer questions from people who had already decided what story they wanted told, or disappear and let the story stand the way it was already being written. You chose to disappear into a cave for 18 years, Dana said, instead of coming home. I chose to disappear, Harlan said. The cave came later. I moved through several places before I found this one. It turned out to be easier to disappear here than anywhere else I tried. Nobody comes looking in a system this deep unless they have a very specific reason to. I had a reason, Dana said. Except I didn't know it was you. I came down here for a graduate student who wandered too far into a cave he had no business exploring alone. Did you find him? Dana's stomach dropped. In the shock of the last several minutes, she'd nearly forgotten the actual reason she'd descended into this cave system at all. No, she said. Not yet. Harlan was already reaching for a small, worn pack beside his sleeping area. There's a passage system on the chamber's east side that connects to a lower section I've mapped over the years, one that doesn't appear on any survey the county has access to. If your student wandered in blind, that's where the cave would have taken him, whether he meant to go there or not. He looked at her directly. I can take you there faster than you'll find it alone, even with everything I taught you 20 years ago. Dana studied him for a long moment, a man she had buried, emotionally if not literally, 18 years earlier, now offering to guide her through a cave system he'd apparently mapped more thoroughly than the county's own survey teams, in order to save a stranger neither of them had ever met. Let's go, she said. They found Colin Ashby 40 minutes later, in a small isolated pocket chamber exactly where Harlan's unofficial map indicated it would be, dehydrated, his ankle badly sprained from a fall 3 days earlier, but alive, conscious, and considerably more relieved to see two strangers with headlamps than either of them had expected given the circumstances. I thought I was going to die down here, Colin said, his voice cracking as Dana checked his ankle and Harlan produced a water supply from his own pack, without a word. You're not going to die down here, Dana said. You're going to have a very long story to tell people who won't fully believe you, and that's going to have to be good enough. The trip back to the surface took nearly 5 hours. Colin supported between them for the sections requiring mobility, carried in an improvised sling Harlan constructed from cave rope, and his own weathered jacket for the sections requiring neither of them to be walking at all. Dana radioed the surface team the moment they reached a section of the cave with signal reception, requesting an emergency medical extraction team and providing coordinates that made Russ Calloway, listening on the other end, go completely silent for several long seconds before responding. You found him, Russ said finally. You actually found him. I found him, Dana confirmed. I'm also bringing out someone else. You're going to want to have people ready who can handle a situation considerably more complicated than a graduate student with a sprained ankle. What kind of complicated? Russ asked. Dana looked at Harlan, walking a few feet ahead of her with the specific measured pace of a man conserving energy after nearly 2 decades of chronic deprivation, and considered how to answer that question in a way that wouldn't sound insane over an open radio channel. The kind that's going to require you to make some calls to people considerably above your pay grade, she said. Just have the medical team ready. I'll explain the rest when we're topside. Subscribe to Legendary Veterans, because what happens when Dana and Harlan finally reach daylight is the reason this story is still being discussed in circles most people will never have access to. They emerged from the cave entrance a little after 7 that evening, into the specific golden light of a Kentucky sunset that Harlan Reese had not seen directly in 18 years. He stopped a few feet from the entrance, simply standing still, his weathered face turned toward a sun he'd apparently forgotten the exact quality of, and Dana let him have that moment without speaking, understanding, in a way she suspected nobody else standing at that staging area could fully understand exactly what he was experiencing. Russ Calloway was the first to reach them, his earlier dismissiveness entirely gone, replaced by the specific stunned deference of a man watching an impossible outcome unfold directly in front of him. He looked at Colin, secured onto a stretcher and already being assessed by paramedics, then at Harlan, gaunt and ragged and unmistakably, improbably alive, and then at Dana. "Who is this?" Russ asked quietly. "Someone the record has wrong," Dana said. "I'd start there and let the people with the actual clearance to know more fill in the rest." Russ didn't press further immediately. He simply nodded, the nod of a man recalibrating an entire framework of assumptions in real time, and turned to organize the medical response Harlan's condition clearly required. Tyler, the young volunteer who'd smirked at Dana that morning, stood near the equipment staging area, staring at the scene with an expression that had moved entirely past his earlier amusement into something closer to genuine shock. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Dana caught his eye briefly as she passed, and something in her own expression, calm but unmistakably firm, told him everything he needed to understand about the last several hours without either of them exchanging a single word about it. The official call came within the hour, a black sedan arriving at the staging area with the specific unhurried authority of people who had been waiting a very long time for exactly this kind of news, whether or not they'd expected to ever actually receive it. A woman in a plain dark jacket, mid-50s, stepped out and crossed directly to where Harlan sat wrapped in an emergency blanket, being assessed by paramedics before transport. She stopped in front of him, and for a long moment, neither of them said anything at all. "Colonel Reese," she said finally, her voice carrying a formality that seemed to cost her considerable effort to maintain. "Not anymore," Harlan said. "Haven't been in a long time. The record says you died in service 18 years ago." Her voice cracked slightly on the word died. "I commanded the unit that inherited your case file. I've read the after-action report more times than I can count. I never believed the official version, and I never had a way to prove it wrong." "You don't have to prove anything now," Harlan said. "I'm sitting right in front of you." The woman looked at Dana next, studying her with the specific measuring attention of someone assessing an unknown variable in an equation she'd been trying to solve for a very long time. "And you are someone he trained a long time ago," Dana said. "Someone who happened to still remember how to read markings on a cave wall." The woman absorbed that without further question, the specific acceptance of someone who had learned, over a long career, exactly which details were worth pressing for, and which ones belonged to people who had earned the right to keep them private. Harlan was transported to a military medical facility 2 hours later, accompanied by personnel who arrived with considerably more clearance than the local paramedics, and considerably less willingness to answer any of Russ Calloway's questions about what, precisely, had just happened on his search and rescue operation. Dana stayed behind at the staging area long after the last vehicle departed, sitting on the tailgate of her own truck in the deepening dark, replaying 18 years of grief she had built an entire adult life around, now abruptly, disorientingly, requiring an entirely different foundation. Russ found her there an hour later, approaching slowly, the specific caution of a man uncertain of his welcome after the morning's exchange. "I laughed at you," he said. "This morning. Told you to go home." "You did," Dana said, without heat. "I've run search operations in this county for 22 years, Russ said. "I thought I understood what capability looked like, walking through my staging area. I've never been more wrong about anyone in my life." Dana considered him for a long moment. "You made a judgment based on what you could see," she said. "Most people do. The mistake isn't making the judgment. It's not staying curious enough to update it when the evidence changes. Russ absorbed that, nodding slowly. Would you consider consulting for the team? He asked. Officially. Cave rescue, technical extraction, whatever you're willing to teach us. Dana looked back toward the cave entrance, now just a dark seam in the hillside under the rising moon. The specific darkness that had held her former instructor for 18 silent years before delivering him back into a world that had long since stopped looking for him. I'll think about it, she said. It wasn't a yes. It also wasn't a no. 3 weeks later, Dana received a call from a hospital 2 states away. Harlan Reese, recovering steadily, physically stronger each week, but carrying an adjustment to modern life that no amount of physical therapy could fully address, had asked specifically to speak with her. They want to give me a medal, he said, when she picked up. His voice had regained some of its old dry humor. 18 years late. I told them I'd rather they gave it to you instead, for finding me, but apparently that's not how the paperwork works. I don't need a medal, Dana said. I know, Harlan said. That's exactly what I told them you'd say. They talked for nearly an hour, the specific, unhurried conversation of 2 people rebuilding a connection across a gap that had briefly seemed permanent. And when the call ended, Dana sat for a long while in the quiet of her own kitchen, thinking about markings scratched into limestone, about a man who had chosen 18 years of isolation over a version of the truth he refused to let stand uncorrected, and about how close an entire county had come to walking straight past him without ever knowing what they'd missed. Some people carry the story of the day they were finally found. Dana carried the story of the day she stopped believing someone was gone forever, and she understood, sitting in that quiet kitchen, that some searches only end when the person doing the looking refuses to accept the easy answer everyone else has already settled for. If this story kept you here until the very last word, share it with someone who needs a reminder that some people never stop looking, even after everyone else has given up. That's the whole reason stories like this one get told at all.